Amid the howling blizzard, a mother bear struggled to stay upright, her two cubs frozen and lifeless in the snow. Just feet away, inside the cabin, a man stared at the door, torn between risking his life to save them or letting the wild decide their fate. His choice will leave you stunned. Adam jolted awake as the wind slammed into the side of the cabin like a battering ram. The walls groaned under the force, the sound sharp and menacing, a reminder of just how fragile his sanctuary was in the face of the storm. For a moment, he sat still on the edge of his cot, listening. The gusts shrieked through the cracks around the windows, carrying with them the biting chill of the night. His breath puffed out in little clouds, visible even in the dim light of the room. The thermometer, nailed to the wall beside the front door, was useless. He knew it was below 40 now, maybe worse. The frost creeping up the inside of the window pane told him everything he needed to know about the cold out there. Still, he rose, bare feet hitting the rough wooden floor, and padded over to check. He always checked. Pulling back the thick blanket covering the glass, he squinted into the swirling white chaos outside. The floodlight he'd rigged on the corner of the porch barely pierced the storm, casting a pale, trembling halo of light onto the snowdrifts that had already started piling up against the steps. Beyond that, the world was a void, an endless, howling void. Something shifted in the shadows just beyond the porch. Adam stiffened, his heart leaping into his throat. He flicked the flashlight on the windowsill and aimed it through the glass. The beam caught the faint outline of movement, a flash of fur. His stomach knotted. Wolves, he muttered to himself, though it did little to calm his nerves. He'd seen their tracks this morning, winding too close to the cabin for comfort. A small pack, maybe 3 or 4, had been prowling the area for weeks now, and storms like this only made them bolder. Hunger drove them, same as everything else out here. Adam lived alone in the middle of the Alaskan wilderness, 4 hours from the nearest town by car. It had been his choice, leaving behind the bustling chaos of Seattle 5 years ago to start a quieter, simpler life as a wildlife photographer. The silence and solitude here had called to him then, but now, on nights like this, it felt more like exile than peace. Still, he kept himself busy. That morning he'd spent hours checking his supplies. He counted the wood stacked neatly by the stove, made sure the generator was running smoothly, and went through his stock of canned goods. The radio had buzzed with bad news. A storm system rolling down from the north, bringing record-breaking lows. It would last for days, they said, maybe longer. The walls of the cabin were lined with photos, images of bears, moose, wolves and eagles he'd captured during his years of wandering these wilds. In their silent way, they were his companions, keeping him tethered to his purpose. He found himself staring at a photo of a mother wolf and her pups, taken years ago in the spring. Adam's grip tightened on the curtain as he turned back to the window. Another gust rattled the glass, and he let the blanket fall back into place. The stove in the corner of the room still glowed faintly, embers flickering, but the heat barely touched the edges of the cabin. He shoved a few more logs into the firebox and stoked the flames until they caught, then stood there for a moment, soaking in the fleeting warmth. The radio crackled to life on the table behind him, startling him. It was a shortwave set, old but reliable. He flipped the switch and turned the dial, trying to bring the static into focus. "This is an update from the National Weather Service." The announcer's voice finally cut through the noise. "The storm system moving through the region is expected to intensify overnight, with wind chills reaching—" The broadcast fizzled into static again, and Adam clicked it off with a sigh. He didn't need anyone to tell him it was going to get worse. He moved to the kitchen area, grabbing a can of soup from the shelf and opening it with a mechanical efficiency born of routine. The faint howl of wolves reached his ears again as he poured the soup into a pot and set it on the stovetop. He froze, listening. This time, the sound was closer. "Damn it," he muttered, grabbing his shotgun from the rack by the door. He wasn't eager to use it, but he also wasn't eager to become dinner. He checked the chamber, confirming it was loaded, and placed it within reach of the stove. The soup began to bubble, the steam curling upward in delicate tendrils. For a moment, the cabin felt almost cozy, the fire casting dancing shadows on the walls. But the illusion didn't last. A sudden thud on the porch made him jump, nearly spilling the pot as he spun toward the door. His mind raced. The wolves wouldn't be that bold, would they? Gripping the shotgun, Adam moved to the door. He pressed his ear to the wood, holding his breath. Another thud, softer this time, followed by a low, guttural sound that sent a shiver racing down his spine. Not wolves. The soup hissed on the stovetop, the faint warmth of the cabin doing its best to ward off the cold creeping through every crack. Adam tightened his grip on the shotgun. The second thud, softer this time, had been followed by a low sound, a guttural, mournful rumble that didn't belong to wolves. His breath caught in his throat, and for a moment he thought about ignoring it. But then the sound came again, cutting through the howl of the wind like a raw, pleading whisper. "Damn it," Adam muttered under his breath, stepping closer to the window. He yanked the blanket aside and shined his flashlight into the storm. At first, there was nothing but the blinding white of snow and the sharp shadows it cast. Then he saw it. 3 forms moved through the snow, their shapes sluggish and barely distinguishable against the storm. A larger figure lumbered ahead, swaying with each step, while 2 smaller ones struggled to keep up. The beam of light flickered across matted fur coated in ice, and Adam's stomach sank. A bear, a mother bear, and her cubs. The larger one stumbled, catching herself awkwardly, her massive shoulders heaving as she turned her head to nudge the cub behind her. The smaller form had collapsed, its body half buried in the snow. The other cub hovered nearby, its legs trembling as it tried to stay upright. Adam let the blanket drop and stepped back, heart pounding. "No, no, no," he muttered. "Not my problem." He forced himself to take a deep breath, leaning against the wall as the sounds outside grew faint again, almost swallowed by the storm. He knew the rules. He'd lived by them for years. You didn't interfere with wildlife. You didn't invite trouble into your space. Nature was brutal, but it had its way of balancing things. But that sound, that terrible, pleading sound. Adam grabbed his coat and threw it over his shoulders, pacing as his mind raced. What could he even do? Those cubs wouldn't survive the night, and the mother bear wasn't much better off. If he opened that door, he was risking his life. A desperate bear, especially one trying to protect her cubs, could destroy the cabin and him. But if he didn't, he couldn't shake the image of the smaller cub lying motionless in the snow, its tiny body overwhelmed by the storm. He'd seen things like that before through his camera lens, life ebbing away in the wild. He'd always told himself it was part of the natural order. It wasn't his job to interfere. Adam swore under his breath and grabbed the flashlight again, moving back to the window. The bears were closer now. The mother had reached the edge of the porch, her massive frame swaying like a dying tree. One of the cubs huddled against her, shivering violently, while the other still lay in the snow, unmoving. She turned her head, her gaze fixed on the cabin door, as though sensing the warmth inside. The wind screamed, rattling the walls, and somewhere in the distance, a wolf howled. The sound was sharp and eerie, slicing through the storm like a warning. Adam's fingers tightened around the flashlight, his stomach knotting. The wolves wouldn't dare approach the bears, not with the mother still standing. But if she fell... Adam turned away from the window, his mind a whirlwind of fear and frustration. He had no obligation to those bears. Opening that door would be suicide. But could he really sit there, letting them die inches from safety? The cubs were slipping into the final, merciless stages of hypothermia, their tiny bodies slowly surrendering to the unforgiving cold. The mother bear's breaths came in faint, uneven intervals, her enormous form barely stirring as the snow piled relentlessly around her. Each shallow rise and fall of her chest seemed a battle against the freezing grip of the storm. Adam's emergency radio hissed to life, its distorted voice breaking through the relentless howl of the wind. The latest update was grim. The storm would rage on for another 12 hours at least. The conditions outside were worsening by the minute. He didn't need the forecast to tell him what he already knew. The bears wouldn't last until morning. The frost clinging to their fur had hardened into thick, icy shells, and their labored breathing had slowed to a perilous rhythm. Adam's thoughts churned, searching for a solution. He glanced at the storage room attached to his cabin, a space he'd originally built for stashing his photography gear. It was separate from his main living area, with its own entrance and well insulated to protect his equipment from the elements. A plan began to form in his mind, but it came with risks he couldn't ignore. He glanced toward the shotgun propped by the door and then to the thick wool blankets folded on the chair. "You're out of your damn mind, Anderson," he muttered, grabbing the blankets. Adam shrugged off his bulky winter coat. If he was going to go through with this, he needed to stay agile. Sliding his hands into the thickest gloves he owned, he grabbed a few heavy blankets from his emergency stash. His fingers trembled slightly as he picked up his satellite phone for one last check. Deep down, he knew it wouldn't be any use if things went sideways in weather like this. As he watched the mother bear's chest rise and fall in labored breaths, his resolve hardened. The cubs had gone completely still. The faintest motion in their chests was the only proof they were still alive. The mother bear, her strength visibly failing, had started to slump forward. Her eyes half closed as the cold sank its claws deeper into her body. She was losing. And unless Adam did something right now, they'd all lose this fight against the relentless freeze. He inhaled deeply, steadying himself, and set to work with determination overtaking doubt. He turned up every heating unit in the storage room, cranking them as high as they'd go to make the space as warm as possible. The blankets were arranged carefully by the door, ready to be used in an instant. His hands, which had shaken minutes before, now moved with a purpose as clear as the icy air outside. Through the frosty pane of the window, the mother bear's gaze remained fixed on him. It wasn't the wild, frenzied stare of a cornered animal. It was something else entirely. There was a depth in her eyes, an awareness that reached across the divide between human and beast. She tracked his movements as he prepared, her eyes unblinking, as though she knew he might be their only chance. In that fleeting moment, Adam didn't see her as a threat. She wasn't a dangerous predator lurking in the snow. She was a mother, desperately clinging to what little hope remained to save her cubs. Outside, the wind howled louder, battering the cabin like a relentless beast, and the temperature continued its cruel descent. Glancing at the clock, Adam saw it was just after 2 in the morning, the darkest, coldest hour of the night. This was when the wilds of Alaska were at their most unforgiving. Every lesson he'd learned about survival and wildlife screamed at him to stay inside. Yet, with the bear's faint forms barely visible now under the growing drifts of snow, his hand returned to the door handle. Taking one last breath, he braced himself and turned the handle. The door creaked open, the sound cutting through the storm like a sharp blade. A blast of icy wind and swirling snow immediately greeted him, stinging his face and stealing his breath. Just a few feet away, the bears lay huddled together, almost swallowed by the encroaching snowdrifts. The mother bear's head lifted faintly at the sound of the door, her dark eyes flickering with recognition. Her muscles tensed briefly, but she made no move to rise. Even her survival instincts, honed by years in the wild, seemed dulled by the exhaustion overtaking her body. Adam stepped onto the porch, his movements deliberate and unhurried. He kept his body language as non-threatening as possible, speaking softly, though the words were more for his own nerves than hers. "It's okay," he murmured, his voice nearly lost in the roar of the storm. "I'm not here to hurt you." The mother bear sniffed the air, her nostrils flaring weakly as she registered his scent. Even that small effort looked like it cost her dearly. Her body swayed slightly, her strength clearly hanging by a thread. Slowly, Adam began clearing a path through the snow, creating a way from the porch to the open storage room door. Every movement was measured, every step deliberate, his breath clouding the frigid air. "It's all right," he whispered again, knowing full well the bears couldn't understand him, but hoping the tone might calm them. The mother bear watched him closely, her gaze sharper now, but still devoid of aggression. Her eyes carried a silent plea, one that struck Adam like a blow to the chest. It wasn't words or actions, but something primal, a desperate need to save her young, no matter the cost. The cubs, barely visible under their mother's protective bulk, hadn't moved. Their tiny forms were almost completely covered in snow, and Adam could hardly see the rise and fall of their fragile chests anymore. Time was slipping through his fingers like the icy wind that bit at his skin. He crouched slowly, laying the first blanket closer to the bears. The mother bear tensed for a brief moment, but didn't react further. The mother bear watched him, her eyes showing more awareness now, but still no aggression. The cubs hadn't stirred, their tiny forms nearly swallowed by the thick snowdrifts. Adam strained to see the faint rise and fall of their chests, but the icy layers made it almost impossible. Time wasn't on their side. Out here, in the bitter cold, even a few extra minutes exposed to the storm could be a death sentence, no matter how many layers he wore. He had to make a decision, now, or walk away and accept the inevitable. With shaking hands, Adam swung open the storage room door, releasing a rush of warm air into the frozen night. It billowed out in a brief cloud of mist, dissolving almost as quickly as it appeared. The mother bear's head lifted ever so slightly, her nose twitching as she caught the scent of heat. It was the first significant movement she'd made in what felt like an eternity. Adam swallowed hard, his pulse hammering in his ears as he took a step forward. He clutched the blankets tightly, knowing full well this was the most dangerous gamble he'd ever taken. The mother's eyes, dark and glassy with exhaustion, locked onto him, tracking his every move. Her usual fierce protectiveness seemed dulled, overtaken by sheer fatigue and the relentless cold. When he was close enough, he hesitated, taking a moment to steady his breath. Then, in one fluid motion, he tossed the first blanket over the cubs. The thick fabric settled over their frail bodies, the snow clinging to its edges. For a split second, the mother bear tensed, her muscles stiffening as if on the verge of attack. Adam froze, his lungs tightening as he waited for her reaction. But instead of lunging, she sniffed the blanket, tentatively, then nudged it with her nose. Her massive frame moved sluggishly as she began to press the edges of the wool closer around her cubs, an action so deliberate it almost seemed human. Seeing her acceptance, Adam placed another blanket closer to the open door, creating a path that led to the warmth inside. The icy wind bit into his exposed face and hands, numbing his fingers as he worked. He couldn't stay out here much longer. His movements were slowing, his body screaming for him to retreat. Everything depended on the mother bear now. She made a feeble attempt to stand, her legs trembling violently under her weight. The cubs beneath the blanket remained motionless, their fragile bodies still hidden. With painstaking care, the mother leaned down, nuzzling one of the cubs in an effort to rouse it. But it didn't respond. The second cub, equally still, seemed no better off. A deep, guttural noise escaped her throat, a sound so raw and filled with anguish that it made Adam's chest tighten. It was the sound of a mother unable to save her children, a cry of hopelessness carried on the howling wind. Adam stepped back, slowly, giving her space, every move calculated to avoid startling her. He stopped just outside the storage room door, where the warmth pouring out created a beacon of survival in the darkness. His heart pounded as he watched, silently urging her to make a decision. She swayed on unsteady legs, her gaze darting between the cubs and the open door. Her breath came in heavy bursts, each exhale forming brief clouds in the frozen air. Then, with almost agonizing slowness, she bent down and gripped the edge of the blanket in her teeth. Adam's breath caught as the mother bear began dragging her cubs toward the storage room, her steps labored and uneven. The blanket made the movement easier, but every inch seemed to sap what little strength she had left. Her muscles trembled with the effort, but she pressed forward, driven by an unyielding maternal instinct. The distance was only a few yards, but it might as well have been miles. Adam held himself still, barely daring to breathe as the family inched closer to safety. The wind howled mercilessly, nearly knocking him off balance, but the mother bear refused to stop. Her determination was a force of nature, even as exhaustion threatened to bring her down. At last, she reached the doorway, her massive body blocking the entrance. Steam rose from her fur as the warm air met the frozen surface, creating an eerie halo around her form. For a heartbeat, Adam thought she might panic, turn back, or collapse. But instead, she gave one final pull, dragging the cubs over the threshold and into the shelter. She collapsed beside them, her enormous body curling protectively around their small forms as the warmth began to seep into their frozen fur. Adam moved with painstaking care, closing the door behind them as quietly as possible. Through the small window in the door, he watched the family huddle together. The mother's eyes remained fixed on him, her body still tense, but some of the desperation in her gaze had begun to fade. Hours passed as the storm outside reached its peak, shaking the cabin with an unrelenting fury. But in the storage room, life stirred. The cubs were the first to respond to the warmth, their tiny bodies twitching beneath the blankets. Their movements were weak, barely perceptible at first, but as the hours stretched on, they grew stronger. The mother bear, though utterly spent, nuzzled each cub in turn, coaxing them back to life with a tenderness that defied her massive frame. She never took her eyes off the window, watching Adam with an expression that had shifted from wary despair to something that almost resembled trust. During that time, Adam made it a point to leave water and food near the storage room door while the bears slept. The mother bear, initially wary of his gestures, began to cautiously accept his offerings. He noticed that she waited until he retreated to a safe distance before cautiously approaching the provisions, a delicate balance between survival instinct and trust. By the morning of the third day, the storm had finally passed. Outside, the world had transformed into a glistening expanse of snow and ice, shimmering under the first rays of sunlight that had pierced the grey clouds in days. The temperature, however, had started to climb. The sunlight carried with it a quiet promise of renewal. Adam knew the moment had come. The bears needed to return to the wilderness before the fragile trust they had developed blurred the lines of their natural instincts. The mother bear seemed to sense the shift. She had grown restless, her primal urges pulling her back toward the forest. The cubs, fully recovered and full of energy, had begun to move with the boundless curiosity of the young. Moving with the same deliberate care he had shown that fateful night, Adam unlatched the outer door of the storage room. Crisp, cold air rushed in, mingling with the lingering warmth inside. The sunlight spilled into the room, catching the frost that still clung to the edges of the walls. The mother bear lifted her head, her nose twitching as she caught the scent of fresh air and the subtle signals of a changing season. Rising to her full height, she appeared regal and strong once more, an unrecognizable transformation from the exhausted creature that had staggered to his porch just nights ago. The cubs trailed behind her, their small frames now filled with vitality as they bounded toward the open door. They hesitated momentarily, their bright, eager movements betraying their newfound strength. At the threshold, the mother bear stopped. She turned her massive head, her dark eyes meeting Adam's. He stood several feet away, respectful of the unspoken boundary between them. Their gaze locked, and in that brief, silent exchange, Adam felt he understood something profound, an unspoken truth about the shared threads that bind all living beings. With a surprising fluidity that defied her size, the bear turned and stepped into the snow. The cubs followed her lead, their small bodies weaving through the fresh drifts with playful abandon. Adam stayed on the porch, watching as they made their way toward the forest's edge. The mother bear moved with deliberate steps, her shadow stretching long and stately across the white expanse, her form illuminated by the rising sun. Just before they disappeared into the trees, she paused. Her powerful silhouette stood framed by the sunlight, her presence commanding even from a distance. For a long moment, she looked back, her gaze lingering as though imprinting the moment. Then, with quiet resolve, she turned and vanished into the woods, the cubs scampering behind her. The only trace of their extraordinary encounter was a series of tracks carved into the snow, leading into the wilderness. Adam remained by the window long after they were gone, the silence of the landscape settling around him like a second skin. Years had passed since that stormy night when Adam had opened his door to a desperate mother bear and her cubs. The memory of those harrowing days remained vivid, etched into his mind like the grooves of the rugged Alaskan landscape. He'd often thought about them, wondering if the mother bear had managed to raise her cubs to survive the brutal wilderness. Winters had come and gone, each one a reminder of that fateful storm. Adam had grown older, his hair now streaked with grey, though his rugged build and sharp gaze showed he was as much a part of this wild terrain as the trees and snowdrifts. His cabin, battered by countless storms, still stood resilient against the elements. The walls bore the familiar scars of time, but they also carried the warmth of stories lived within them. One evening, as the late sun dipped behind the mountains, painting the snow in golden hues, Adam sat on his porch. A hot mug of coffee warmed his hands, its steam rising into the cold air. He'd been watching the tree line, a habit he'd developed over the years, though he rarely admitted to himself what he was hoping to see. And then, movement. At first, it was nothing more than a flicker of shadows among the dense pines. His breath caught as he leaned forward, setting the mug aside. Slowly, the shadows grew clearer, shapes emerging from the forest. Bears. A large, powerful bear stepped out first, her frame illuminated by the fading sunlight. Her fur was thick and dark, her steps steady and deliberate. Behind her, two younger bears followed, their forms sleek and strong, but unmistakably youthful. Adam's heart raced as he stood, barely aware of the cold air biting through his flannel shirt. He didn't need a closer look to know. It was them. The cubs, no longer the fragile, shivering creatures he'd once sheltered, had grown into formidable animals. Their movements were confident, yet cautious, as they followed their mother. She, too, had changed. Gone was the gaunt, desperate figure that had clawed through the snow for survival. She now carried herself with the strength and pride of a survivor who had endured and thrived. The bears paused at the edge of the clearing, the mother raising her head to sniff the air. Her dark eyes scanned the familiar landscape, and then, as if guided by some unspoken connection, her gaze landed on Adam. He felt his breath hitch, his chest tight with a rush of emotions he couldn't name. It was her. He knew it, without a doubt. Unbelievable, he whispered, his voice cracking under the weight of the moment. The younger bears stayed close to her flanks, their curious eyes darting toward the cabin. They didn't seem to share their mother's calm recognition, shifting uneasily as they took in the sight of the human standing on the porch. But the mother bear didn't move. She stood there, watching him, her massive frame framed by the forest behind her. Her eyes held the same steady intelligence, the same quiet understanding that had frozen him in place all those years ago. Adam raised a hand slowly, a gesture not of command, but of greeting. "It's good to see you," he said softly, though he knew she couldn't hear the words, let alone understand them. For a long moment, they simply watched each other, the silence between them filled with more meaning than any words could carry. The sun dipped lower, casting the clearing in deepening shadow. The air was still, as though the entire world was holding its breath. Finally, the mother bear turned, nudging one of her offspring with her nose. The young bear gave a soft huff, reluctant but obedient, as they began to move back toward the forest. The other cub followed suit, glancing back at Adam with a mix of curiosity and caution. As they disappeared into the trees, the mother bear lingered one last time. She looked back, her silhouette stark against the twilight. It was the same gesture she'd made all those years ago, a final glance over her shoulder before vanishing into the wilderness. Adam stood there long after they were gone, the warmth of his coffee long forgotten. The tracks they left in the snow led into the woods, just as they had before, but this time the feeling was different. They had survived. They had grown. For Adam, the moment wasn't just a reunion. It was a quiet validation of the choice he'd made that night so many winters ago. Breaking every rule, risking his life. It had been worth it. He turned and walked back into the cabin, the door creaking softly as it closed behind him. Through the window he could see the tree line bathed in the faint glow of moonlight. The forest felt alive in a way it hadn't in years. Adam poured himself a fresh mug of coffee and sat by the fire, the warmth spreading through his chest as he thought about the bears. He didn't need a photograph to remember them. Some things he knew were better left unframed, carried instead in the quiet corners of memory where they could never fade. As the fire crackled and the night deepened, Adam smiled to himself. The wilderness had its way of giving back, even in the smallest of moments. Wow, what a journey, right? This story may be fictional, but it's packed with powerful lessons and moments that truly resonate. It reminds us that sometimes the choices we make, especially the difficult, gut-wrenching ones, can have lasting effects in ways we never imagine. Adam's decision to help those bears wasn't just about breaking the rules of wilderness survival. It was about compassion, about recognizing that our lives are intertwined with the natural world, no matter how wild or untamed it may seem. What struck me the most was the mother bear's determination and her bond with her cubs. Even at the brink of death, she pushed forward, driven by her instinct to protect her young. It's a stark reminder of the resilience of nature, but also its vulnerability. And then there's Adam, who represents something we all aspire to be. Someone willing to risk it all for what's right, even when fear and logic scream otherwise. But this story also leaves us with a question. What would we do in Adam's position? Would we open the door, knowing the risks? Or would we stay safe inside, hoping nature would take care of itself? I think what makes this story so meaningful is how it speaks to the balance between humanity and the wild. It's not just a tale of survival. It's about connection, responsibility, and how even a single act of kindness can ripple across time. So, what do you think? Would you have made the same choice as Adam? Let me know in the comments below. I'd love to hear your thoughts on what this story means to you. And if you found it as moving as I did, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more incredible stories like this one. Until next time, take care and stay inspired.